The Agony in the Garden by Giovanni Bellini. Giovanni Bellini was born into a prominent Venetian family of artists in 1430. Giovanni would come to be known as the father of the Venetian Renaissance, revolutionizing the use of color and light and cementing Venice's role as a leader in high Renaissance art. In fact, both Titian and Giorgione, giants of the high Renaissance, were trained by Bellini. While Giovanni is the most famous of the Bellini family, his father Jacopo and his brother Gentile were also extremely skilled popular painters. The two generations of Bellinis had one of the busiest workshops in Venice. In addition, the artist from Padua, Andrea Mantegna, referred to as the first great painter of northern Italy, married Giovanni's sister. Jacopo, the patriarch of the family, likely arranged the marriage, recognizing the power of Mantegna's art. However, shortly after the marriage, Mantegna received an offer he could not pass up and became court painter for the Duke of Mantua. Mantegna's own painting of the Agony in the Garden is the inspiration behind the work we will be examining today. Giovanni Bellini had a career that spanned 65 years. During that time, he remained open to learning new techniques and expanding his knowledge, even learning from students. So his work from different time periods each will have their own features. A few years after this painting, Bellini would be introduced to the new medium of oils, and his mastery of that medium and the aesthetics of the Northern Renaissance painters will change the course of art in Venice and push Venice to the forefront of Italian high Renaissance art. One of the aspects of Northern Renaissance painting that resonated deeply with Bellini is their use of symbolism in their paintings. In the North, flowers, towels, candles, and more were imbued with meaning. Albrecht Dürer, the Da Vinci of the Northern Renaissance, once commented of Bellini that he was the best painter of all. Many of Bellini's works were commissioned specifically as meditative pieces by sophisticated patrons who sought out his works precisely because of the complicated symbolic compositions. In particular, Bellini elevated landscapes in his painting to be more than a mere backdrop for the main figures, but to include details and symbols that enriched the story and gave additional elements to augment the message. While those are the elements that Giovanni is remembered for, today we're going to be looking at a painting from his very early period, possibly while he was still an apprentice. It is obvious that the work is a study of a painting that his brother-in-law Mantegna had painted about 5 years earlier, and these two works now hang side by side in the National Gallery in London. The similarities between the paintings is clear. In fact, Bellini's painting was believed to be a Mantegna for years. Bellini was heavily influenced by his brother-in-law and felt that his own work was of a lesser quality. Some speculate that Mantegna assigned this painting to Giovanni as an exercise during his apprenticeship. Artists frequently use the works of others as studies to improve specific skills and to begin to make changes to find their own styles. While there are striking similarities between Mantegna's work and Bellini's, we can see some important stylistic differences. Bellini's painting is more open and hopeful. Most notably, Bellini will become known for the beautiful way he paints light. In this work, the morning light is just breaking, casting a pink glow over the painting. While Bellini was influenced by his brother-in-law, he did not merely imitate, but he used him as a springboard to develop his own unique vision. We know that the first commission Bellini received was in 1470, and that this work was completed sometime between 1456 and 1465. From that information, we can assume that Giovanni had not yet become a master painter. While in later years Bellini will be known for his adept use of oils, this work was painted with tempera, an egg-based paint, onto a wooden panel. The strong lines and contours have a crispness to them that is distinctive. In these early works, Bellini paints with deep religious feeling and a sympathy for the human condition. There is an intensity to his devotion that will mellow a bit with time. His paintings will continue to contain religious devotion, but future paintings there will be more serenity and harmony, taking the edge off the intensity of his early religious works. The painting on one level is a straightforward presentation of the biblical story of Christ praying in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night that he will be betrayed by Judas. Christ has left the Last Supper and sought out a place of quiet solitude to pray. Jesus has asked his three closest companions, Peter, James, and John, to join him and keep watch while he prays. The disciples cannot stay awake. As we look at the three disciples, we note that, in fact, they do make a good study for an artist working to perfect his use of foreshortening. Foreshortening and the fine points of using perspective were still relatively new, and artists had to spend time and effort mastering the new techniques. As we examine the disciples, we notice that each of them is in a different position, but they each give the impression of deep sleep. When we look at the figure in pink, his mouth is open and you can almost hear him snoring. The disciples are not keeping watch, as Christ has requested, but instead they have left him completely alone during this time of struggle. The disciples' robes and the colors that Bellini has used are some of the most beautiful in the painting. Venice was the hub of the pigment trade in Italy, and so Bellini had access to the best pigments available. During this time, you couldn't go purchase mixed paints. Instead, artists had to become experts at grinding and mixing their own colors, and then matching those colors if they painted some of a painting on one day and they wanted to work in that same area the next day. This was especially true for this painting, which was being painted in tempera. Tempera is a very fast-drying paint. In the next decade, Bellini would be working with oils, and oils have a slower drying time, and that altered the way an artist had to work. The figure of Christ is kneeling in prayer in the painting as he asks God to take this cup, his suffering, from him. We often focus on Christ's physical suffering, which is substantial, and when we consider his passion. But whenever I read the account of his prayer in the garden, I'm struck by the suffering of taking on the sins of mankind and the separation from God the Father that's going to follow that. In Luke's account, we know that his suffering and in this time of prayer was so intense that he sweated blood. As we follow Christ's gaze, we see that he is looking at a small angel, the angel of comfort, who has come to him holding a cup and paten. The paten is the plate that the bread of communion rests on. Sometimes the chalice used in communion is called the cup of suffering, because in order for Christ to redeem the sins of mankind, he has to drink all of the suffering that is in the chalice. Christ has come to pray that if possible, this cup of suffering should pass him by, but if it is not possible, then the Father's will be done. The Agony in the Garden is the first sorrowful mystery of the Rosary. One is to meditate on a list of mysteries from Christ's life while saying the Rosary, and each of the mysteries is connected to a fruit that the believer will gain when they contemplate that mystery. The fruit for the Agony in the Garden is sorrow for sin and uniformity to the will of God. We see that Christ is going to experience the sorrow for sin, even though his suffering is not for his own sin, and that he is willing to make his will one with the Father's will despite the cost. As we examine the figure of Christ, one of the most notable features in the painting is the outcropping of rock that he is kneeling on. Creating a desk for Christ's prayer out of a natural rock formation is a signature Bellini move, using the landscape to further his story. Generally, Renaissance painters painted landscapes merely to fill in the background space. However, as I noted earlier, Bellini had been heavily influenced by the Northern Renaissance painters, whose landscapes often had symbolic meanings. Bellini began to infuse the landscapes of his paintings with layers of content, which appealed to those who wished to purchase the paintings to use for contemplative purposes. As we continue to read the painting, we will find numerous ways that Bellini has used the natural surroundings to give a fuller telling of the story. We find an example of this in the lower right corner of the painting. There is a twig fence encircling the garden, and the gate has been left open. Gardens have a long history of spiritual meaning in the Bible and in Western art. Gardens are often synonymous with the temple. The temple is the place where God meets man. Originally, this meeting place between God and humanity was in the Garden of Eden, but with the fall, man was expelled from the garden, and that place of communion was closed off. God provided a new place for humanity to meet with him when he gave instructions to build the temple. This idea of the connection between the garden and the temple continued in art with the practice of placing the Virgin Mary in a walled garden in Annunciation paintings. The idea of the hortus conclusus, that's Latin for enclosed garden and is an art term, that is a theme in Christian art and one that symbolic use by artists continued to expand throughout the Renaissance. Up until Christ's resurrection, the temple and God were only accessible by certain people, under certain circumstances, at certain times of the year. With Christ's death and resurrection, the problem of sin is dealt with and the need for the temple ceases. Instead, God's people become his temple, and our access to God is no longer impeded. We see the foreshadowing of all of this in the open gate leading into the garden. As Christ is getting ready to head to his death, the gate to God has been opened. Walking through this gate into the garden is interesting in that there is nothing about the area that looks garden-like. In fact, the area is quite barren. It resembles a wilderness more than a garden. In art, placing figures in a wilderness denotes a time of testing and struggle, and that certainly fits the theme of this story. Continuing on to the left, we come to a dead tree. The iconography of trees in Christian art is thought-provoking. Trees are symbols of a life lived according to God's plan. Trees go through a cycle. There is a season of growth, and then the winter comes when the tree is barren, which symbolizes death, and then in the spring we have a picture of resurrection. In the painting, we have a dead tree, representing death and or sinners who are dead due to their sin. Generally, a lone tree in a landscape in a Christian painting represents the tree of life. The tree of knowledge that Adam and Eve ate the apple from was believed to become the wood of the cross that Christ is crucified on. And as the cross is the source of a believer's life and eternal life, the cross then becomes known as the tree of life. So as we continue on from the tree, we find a bridge going over a small brook. This is the Kidron Brook. When there's a rain in Israel, the brook flows through the Kidron Valley. And the Kidron Brook is mentioned multiple times in the Old Testament. It's the brook Kidron that David crosses when fleeing from Absalom. And Jesus crosses the Kidron to enter the Garden of Gethsemane, so he would have just crossed it when we find him praying. But what the brook is primarily known for is its connection to idolatry. The sin of idolatry is one that has plagued the people of Israel throughout their history. When God cleansed the people of idolatry, they were told to grind the idols and pour their ashes into the Kidron Brook. If you want to read more about this, I've linked to an article in the PDF that goes with the video. This cycle of throwing idols into the Kidron Brook happens repeatedly. Let me read you a little bit from the article. It might be thought fanciful to read a spiritual reality into the reference to the brook Kidron, were it not for the fact that it is constantly said to be the place where the idol dust was poured out. Jesus Christ crushed the idols of his people underfoot when he went to the cross. It was there that the stronghold of idolatry was broken. There is really nothing special about the brook Kidron. It is simply a redemptive historical marker of the destruction of idolatry. The destruction of idolatry is completely and utterly dependent upon the person and work of Christ at Calvary. End of quote. So it is significant that Christ's passion begins with crossing the brook Kidron, the spot where God has repeatedly dealt with Israel's sin. As we continue to look at the background of the painting, we see a landscape similar to the countryside surrounding Venice. The hills with the towns, the church steeple rising up would have appeared familiar to the original viewers of this painting. Venetians viewing this work would have recognized their own country and landscape. Just as Tintoretto placed Christ washing the disciples' feet in a Renaissance palace, in the same way Bellini has placed this story in a Venetian countryside. The reason for this is to make the story universal and timeless, to connect it more immediately with those who would be viewing the painting, transporting the biblical narrative into their present time. On the road next to the brook Kidron, we see the Roman soldiers, led by Judas, walking up to the garden to arrest Christ. This group isn't seen by the disciples, who are still sound asleep. They're not seen by Christ, who is consumed by his prayers, but we, the viewers, see them and understand what they mean. The events of the Passion are truly underway. In most artistic works, the agony in the garden is set in the middle of the night. Nighttime is a fitting setting for the story. First, because we know that Christ prayed all night, but also because at this moment in Christ's life, darkness feels very appropriate. However, Bellini makes a different choice. We come to my favorite part of the painting, the morning sky. As Christ is finishing his prayers and the soldiers are rounding the turn in the road to start up the hill, light is breaking. A warm pink light is cast over the scene. The beauty of the morning sky is stunning. Beyond that, sunrises just always feel hopeful. This is not a dark painting of Christ's suffering. Instead, this is a painting full of hope. The sunrise reminds us that the resurrection is coming. There may be dark events still to come, but in the end, there will be a bright new morning, a resurrection morning, when all of creation will celebrate. Giovanni Bellini is believed to be the first Italian painter to paint a sunrise. His ability to paint light, to create atmosphere with light, is considered to be one of his greatest gifts. This painting may have been done while he was still an apprentice, but when we look at that sunrise, we know we're looking at the work of a master. As the sunlight from that sunrise spreads across the landscape, I want to direct our attention back to the figure of Christ. The light is hitting his clothing so that he gleams in the reflection. To magnify the effect of the light on Christ, Bellini has added flecks of gold onto his clothing. This would be actual gold. And that gold subtly reflects the light and adds an element to the scene.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to like this video by giving us a thumbs up below, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss great commentary on classic works of art. KellyBagdanoff.com is your source for great content and curriculum, as well as devotional materials using the medium of art. Make sure you visit and subscribe. Pablo Picasso said, "Art washes from the soul the dust of everyday life." So take a moment to share this video, because art is too important not to share.
See you later, alligator.